It is wonderful to be here for day 3 of this incredible literary festival, and I'm super happy to be on this stage with this particular panel talking about women and women's bodies and women's stories. And I'm going to just start it right off. You've heard their bios. Each one of these writers is and has written transgressive works, which I would love to be able to retire the idea of transgressive works when it comes to women, but we're not there yet. Can we talk just a little bit about writing transgressive stories and centering women's bodies in this moment? And we're in conversation, so this is not going to be a one-off. I want us to riff off of each other and really just have a good conversation that the audience can participate in when it's time for questions.
Can this be heard?
Please.
When we talk about transgressive fiction, I wandered into that space entirely by accident. I was 25, 24, and I sat down to write a novel, and I'd written some very bad poetry and some very bad short stories which didn't, nothing I'd written had really worked, and I'd been thrown out of college, which I guess was transgressive enough. And then, one day, I walked along Marine Drive in Bombay, came back home, and the voice came to me. And the voice came to me, the story came to me, and I had no idea that I was about to begin on one of the most transgressive novels ever written in India, which was my first novel, Paro, Dreams of Passion. And I just wrote what I thought was a funny book with a little bit of humor in it. But people took it very seriously in India. It did well outside, it did very well in London and things like that, where it got nice reviews. But in India, I was called a pornographers. It was not fun, but I didn't particularly care. But that's how it began. And now I meet all kinds of distinguished aging men, gray hair like mine, and they tell me, when we were young, your book was kept on the top shelf of my parents' library so that we couldn't reach it. But we used to, step on a chair and read it, and page 23, there was this line, and so on. That's fun.
I love it. I love that it was in the library, but transgressive. Sonora, how about you?
Yeah, similar to you. I didn't think I was writing something transgressive, and then people will tell you that it's transgressive, right? So in my case, when I wrote, I could talk about my first novel, but I'll talk about How to Raise a Feminist Son, because that was really, for some reason, seen as transgressive because I was getting death threats from, it first came out in the US, so I was getting threats from white men especially, saying, how could you ruin your son's life, and horrible things like, why didn't you just cut off his dick, and things like that, and your child should have been given up for adoption rather than doing this. And I was like, really? If you don't want to raise a feminist son, don't raise a feminist son. I'm just writing to those who might want to, right? So I didn't think it was transgressive, but clearly it ruffled feathers, and that's good, right? That's a good thing. And then, in the new novel, in the laughter, I was again told by the market that it was transgressive because by then I changed agents, and I didn't have an agent, and agent after agent was sending it back and rejecting it, saying, you've written the entire book from the point of view of a white man. We get that you're writing satire and you're trying to do this transgressive thing, but it won't sell. And could you please write from the point of view of the woman of color? So there are ways of being transgressive, and the market tells you you're transgressing into something else. And then it takes one or two people, took the right agent and the right editor to get it and to do that. And then I'm working on another novel that is definitely very transgressive.
So yours was cultural transgression as well as sexual transgression.
Absolutely, yeah. And within that, and if you talk about raising a feminist son. Sohaila yesterday was talking about rape, so Sohaila Abdulali, about her book, What We Talk About When We Talk About Rape. And I was thinking about how, in my book, I've written about how you talk about sex to your son, and that upset people, saying, like, as a mother, you shouldn't be talking to your son about sex, and he shouldn't see you as a sexual being. So, you know, all these transgressive ways. Cat.
I love how I too, it's kind of a rite of passage, people. At some point, if you're a woman writer, you're going to get death threats. It's just kind of like, oh, it's a Tuesday in June, you know. But what I love in this moment also is that they always threaten our children. This is always part of the aggression, right? Because they know that we are parents, and so it becomes a part of a thing that we are presenting in the world. But you are a mother, which is this whole other category of BS, yes? And then, in a moment when they say you are being a bad parent, they threaten violence upon your children, which is definitely an indicator that they're wonderful parents themselves, just models of parenthood throughout the world, you know, as they threaten physical violation to our children on the internet. Great, good job, bro. Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to pretend that I am some reluctant messiah that, oh, why would anyone find my book transgressive? Of course they did. Of course they fucking did, and I knew what I was doing. Please. But, I mean, it seems to me that it's, maybe not in every culture, and I wouldn't begin to speak to every culture, but certainly in the sciences and certainly in many cultures in the US, the female body is always already transgressive in its existence. That it would be in a public space, that it would be spoken of clearly and plainly and with any humor, that it would be a thing that is out there, and that we, with our bodies, these things out here on a stage, my God, should have hid those, right? You know, and so simply to write about it then is already the transgression, no? Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and there are moments in each of your works where you talk specifically about your female body or about female bodies or your characters' female bodies. And I was wondering, how do you decide what is the authentic presentation of the female body? Authentic to you.
Loaded word, authentic.
You're challenging mythology, you're taking on mythology, you're taking on parenting and tropes around how one should relate in the world as a mother to her children in particular, but to her son especially. And you're talking about the history of hundreds of thousands of years. Millions of years of female bodies. 200 million years of female bodies. How do you define that? How do you decide you've got an answer?
No, I don't have an answer. I have a divergent view.
Please.
It just struck me that in my novel, it's the transgressive woman. It's about two women. One is the narrator, somebody called Priya, who adores but also is scared of the awesome power of this woman who has no single redeeming quality in her. And she does everything she ever wants. And why the book did so well was because all the men and women who read it, they loved her for it. And when I wrote a sequel and she was dead in the sequel was flat. So it was the bad woman in my novel that got the love and stayed in print for 40 years and still gets the love. Yeah. But because everybody wants to be that, they want to have the power to reach out and to transgress. It needs a certain strength to do it. And once I wrote the book, my father asked me, what are you writing? And I said, I'm writing a novel. He said, what is it called? I said, it's called Paro, Dreams of Passion. He said, I hope you've been discreet. And I didn't tell him, but he knew I don't do discreet, you know. It's not my major quality. And but Paro, because she was like that, so everywhere there are people who want to break those boundaries. They just don't have the courage to do it, or the good sense, so it's not exactly like that. Everybody longs to be that person who breaks the barriers.
Absolutely, and literature like that, right? The generation in which you write literature like that gives permission to others to have those lives.
But, you know, why people got offended was not because of the transgressive main character. They got offended because I made fun of the two of the men in the book. And that is not allowed. And they said, oh, it's because such a sexual book. But it wasn't the sexuality of it. There were women like Kamala Das writing very sexual books at that time. There was a very sort of sweet, funny, but obnoxious character called BR, and I just gently made fun of him, you know, and of some others, and that hit the sore spot.
Yeah, it's like Margaret Atwood's quote, right, which actually inspired the title of my novel, The Laughter, is that men are afraid that women will laugh at them, and women are afraid that men will kill them. So it's pretty grim, but yes, men do not like to be laughed at, and they also like to be the purveyors of laughter. They're the ones who are funny. Women are not supposed to be funny, and don't you dare turn your wit on a man, right? Not all men, hashtag. Yeah. So, okay. I always have to clarify, because no men will buy my book. But I think to this point, right? What kind of authentic woman, and who are you? Are you presenting and living a life as a fully rounded woman? And that, I think, is a transgression that I have in my life and in memoir. And I never intended to write a memoir. How to Raise a Feminist Son is a memoir. And I never intended to write one because it was, you know, I'm trained as a journalist, I'm a journalism professor, it's just kind of, and an academic, so it's kind of like, ugh, cringe, you don't write about yourself. But there was an honesty to saying, this happened to me. These sexual transgressions were inflicted upon me. And these are the ways in which I will now transgress and get out of my way. And don't tell me what I can and cannot do with my son, right? So, you know, I'm a twice divorced woman, which is like, you allowed one. And then the second one, clearly you are the problem. And you know, and then to not be seen in relationship with men, to be seen as wandering, you know, country to country, etc. All of that is transgression. And so if you're not leading the perfect life, and South Asian culture tells us to do this, right? As long as you are with the husband, with the parents, with, you know, beautifully having this wonderful established life, then you may break a few rules, but then there's one rule too many that you may break. And to me, that is a self-actualized mother rather than a self-sacrificing mother. And that is an authentic woman as well. And even if you look at Hindu culture, Kali is worshipped as a mother, although she was never necessarily a mother herself. But she is the mother who says, get out of my way, my kids, let me do what I'm doing. And she's then worshipped as a mother. So we have to think about what motherhood also represents.
Powerful.
Oh, I don't have to finish up every single time.
Okay, so I'll finish that up before we move on. Because when she said that South Asian women, the Native women everywhere have to live within some sort of cultural, social, emotional boundaries. So when I realized much later that the novel I had written just written it and got published and did well, was actually creating trouble all around. Then I had the good sense to dedicate it to my mother-in-law. So, as a result, it really was because a good thought, because she stood by me, she was on my side. And she could have made a fuss otherwise. I don't know if she would have otherwise made a fuss or not. But she was a solid ally. Once she was a solid ally, the rest of my family anyway would have been a solid ally.
Very clever. Very clever.
No, very well-meant also.
Well, yes, yes. So let's talk a little bit about the physical female body. I was thinking about when I realized I was in the world as a child in a body that had very strict rules. And I was about 8, and I was a tomboy, and I was playing in first grade on the basketball court, and I joined the skin team and pulled off my shirt and played basketball. And my sister tattled on me and ran home. And by the time I got home that evening, I was in really big trouble and was required to wear dresses once a week because I'd clearly gone too far into my being a tomboy. Was there a moment in your upbringings where you came into realization that you were in the world and that there were rules that applied to you that you had been unaware were going to be restrictive to you?
Sure. I mean, one of the foundational moments, long time, decade before I had the idea for my book, I was an art model in college. I was a professional naked person, and so this is one of these beginning drawing classes where there's some naked, usually a chick, up on an actual dais up at the front of the room, and then everyone, in disrobes, and you hold a pose, statuesque, and they sketch you. But this was the 90s, right? So late 90s, and so they would go out for a smoke break, because the kids still smoked back then. Thank God that's changed, at least in the US, right? So they go out and I get to put on a robe and I get to wander through the easels and actually watch my body take form, right? And what was so fascinating, there was a range of genders and a range of sexual orientations in this room, but they were all like 19. So I like to do things that I'm afraid of, and so I no longer have nightmares about being naked. I've done that. But the guys every single time on their easels drew my boobs too big. Every single time. And I don't mean like a little bit, I mean like a cartoon. Like, just like what kind of anime you looking at, just like, and over the course of the semester though, my boobs shrank on the canvas to about this size, down to the D's, and I remember this was the first moment I was like, oh my God, do males live in a different perceptory world? Are we actually wandering through this thing we call reality and actually experiencing it radically differently? Yeah, and the answer is sort of, biologically, maybe a little bit, sometimes kind of complicated, greatly advised by culture, right? But no, that was the moment. My actual naked-ass body in the world and seeing what they saw of it was when I was like, ooh, I gotta figure out why this is different.
This is a difficult question, difficult to talk about, but I think in solidarity with Sohaila, I will talk about it. So I was 8, and I have written about it as well, but I was 8 years old when I realized that I was not like everyone else, not like my brother, that my body was not allowed to run, and I was running to catch up with my friends, to play with them, and I was in an elevator, and a man who lived in the building who was an army officer, my father was in the army, molested me. And so I was stunned, and the worst thing is that I smiled at him as an 8-year-old child because I had been taught to smile at my elders. And I wish I could take back that smile, just like he didn't deserve my smile. And so, I think we become aware of our bodies in the male gaze and in the male hand. And that's very, very common. But the silence is also really common, because I'd never told anyone that. And what told that 8-year-old child that she should not talk about it? What had told that 8-year-old child? And I know there are many women, especially, and people of other genders as well, that have had similar experiences. But something tells you that you ought to stay silent. And that silence, I guess, is something that I'm writing into.
Thank you, Sonora.
Well, I think there's something wrong with me, because I don't have a sense of shame. I just don't. There's a word in Hindi called lok laj. I'm never ashamed of my body, I feel guilty sometimes if I behave badly, but I am not ashamed of my body. I never have been, and nothing has been able to shame me. It's not as though I've not had some molestation. I remember as a young child being in the Kashmir Emporium and somebody doing something not very appropriate, but I just took it in my stride and I said, this person is clearly a nut, and just moved on. But so I've been racking my brain to come up with a good story. But I think I don't feel guilty ever or very rarely. I've never felt sexually guilty. I've done things I could have felt sexually guilty about. I lack that sense of shame.
That's beautiful and empowering. And each of what you're saying are incredibly empowering. Thank you for that. One of the things that you do, especially Sonora and Cat, is bring pop culture into your writing about both relationships and how we are biologically made as women. Can you just talk a little bit about the examples? I've become a Gossip Girl watcher because of you. Gilmore Girls, not Gossip Girls. Wrong one. Gilmore Girls. Sorry, Gilmore Girls. Because of the power of that pop cultural experience that you shared with your son, and am looking at the new Alien movie, bringing into it the reference that you start your book off with. Can you just talk a little bit about the ways in which pop culture influence or are influenced by these stories of women's bodies?
You want to go? That is a big, fat question that can go anywhere. What you want? I can do it.
I'm always happy to talk about the Gilmore Girls. So I'll talk about the Gilmore Girls a little bit, and then you can talk about
sure.
Alien. Okay. The Gilmore Girls is one of the shows. So in my memoir begins with how I taught my son to be a feminist by watching movies, and which doesn't mean that we were watching feminist movies. We were watching every movie and I was like casually doing a feminist deconstruction of it, right? So and then there was, right from The Lion King, there's only one woman character in it. One female character, Kaa the snake, and she's a snake, right? And she's like deceptive, and I remember asking my son, why I would love to see myself a little more in the movies, what's going on? So the Gilmore Girls was a lovely tradition that we would watch that because it was one of the first representations of a single mom on television who was fully actualized, and she was having fun, and she was funny and had an incredible community, and that's what I saw in my life. I've had, an incredible community in Seattle, and so that was something that was being modeled, and so my son and I would sit and watch it, and it was such a lovely tradition of singing along with the title song, where you lead, I will follow, and he's grown up with joy in his life, and I've grown up with the single mother situation being one of joyfulness, and Kamala Harris talks about this, right? Like, what an incredible chosen family. And I think chosen family can be just so much more powerful in so many ways than your biological family. So pop culture does give us these references. It's the way you talk about it, and then have a conversation that's not about your lives, but is about your lives.
Yeah, I think so much of how we understand our body and the world is not simply that looping neurological feedback, that's mapping the body as we sit in our central nervous system, but it's also very storied. We grow up in the stories about the body. We grow up to understand our lives, and many of those stories are quite diverse, so some of them are from pop culture. I'm unusual in that my mother was a pianist and my father was a scientist, so I was never going to be normal. I have an excellent therapist, but she's great. She's very well employed, lots of sessions, right? But it's true that I have access to stories about the body that not everybody does. So if you want me to, I can. In 2012, I was watching the prequel to Alien, which was called Prometheus, very subtle title. And he aims low, and Ridley Scott. And so the main character is Dr. Elizabeth Shaw, and she has been, in this one scene, impregnated with a vicious alien squid, as you do. And she goes up to the med pod, which is the future of all medicine, these sort of sexy coffins that you're supposed to crawl into, and then they just laser you into health or something. Anyway, so she goes up to the med pod, and she wants a very reasonable thing. She says she wants a cesarean, right? Which you would also want when impregnated with a squid. Right, so she asks the med pod for a C-section, and the med pod says, beep boop, I'm sorry, this med pod is calibrated for male patients only. Please seek help elsewhere. They're crashed on an alien planet, you know. So, like, obviously, she's going to have to now self-laser herself with some staples and get the squid out, which is what happens. Subtle, right? But I had access to the story up at Columbia, where I was a PhD student. I was like, oh, what I don't know, because I heard someone in the row behind me say, shit, who does that, right? Like, who sends a multi-trillion-dollar expedition into space and forgets to make sure your equipment works on women? Oh, that's us. Hi, that's actually us, all of us, right now. Everyone in this room who has ovaries is already Dr. Elizabeth Shaw, less of the squid, but otherwise, yeah, you know, because I happen to have access to that story, which is the male norm, which is that we've been doing quite a lot of biology and biomedical science based purely on male bodies and male models for a long time. And so I had access to both, right? And that was part of, obviously, what motivated me to write the book that I did, to make that story accessible to more. But it also really struck me how the privilege of access really limits so many people in terms of how they are able to understand their own bodies. And when we get those news stories, how empowering it can be to have that new frame of reference. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to watch Alien again without remembering that. We're going to have a moment for questions, but I want to ask one more question about this particular moment. I think of writers in particular, but artists generally, as really helping us process the world around us. Never more so than when we're in a moment of crisis or change. What is it you're doing for yourselves to stay whole in this very lively moment globally? And what can we, as writers and readers and citizens of the world, what can we be doing to support writers now to help ensure that you're with us as we need you to be with us through all of this? It's a little question.
Well, in a public way, I curate this festival, which I try to make sure that there are not too many manners. I make sure that there's huge representation of women's voices and that there are sessions like this one. And I also have an informal setup of helping, but not only women, because I don't, in that sense, have a feminist ideology. I do it as a woman, but I do it for anybody who is having a hard time reaching out, is marginalized in any way, has less advantages, whatever the gender, men, women, in between, any of those. So that's that. But for me personally, what keeps me going is the fact that I am a very religious person in the Hindu religion, which is heavily populated by feminine deities. The rest of the world, all the religions, formal religions, have given up on women. In Japan, the goddess Amaterasu was pushed behind a rock by her brother. In Greek mythology and later Roman, Hestia, the Olympus had 6 men and 6 women deities. And then one by one, the women were pushed off, beginning with Hestia, the goddess of the hearth and the household. So everywhere, the women goddesses have disappeared. The Holy Ghost or the Holy Spirit was feminine to begin with, is what I've read. And then it was just neutralized. But in India, this not happened. There are goddesses who are the consorts of gods, but there are lots of goddesses who are 330 billion gods and goddesses, so plenty of them. But the Indian goddess is not always the calm and kind person. They are the Shant goddesses who are the quiet ones, the calm ones, when the life around them is calm. But the same goddesses have an aspect which is fierce. And I worship the fierce goddesses. And they give me strength.
Love that.
For me, like the word self-care has just been so, capitalism has loved it and appropriated it. So I don't necessarily do self-care, but what I do is be in community. I have, as I mentioned, incredible friends and just really people who are dear to me. I talk regularly to my son, and we, sort of navigate a lot of things together. I also, the writing really helps, and then also standing in solidarity with women and other people who've been marginalized and minoritized. I think talking about Dalit women and their experiences, talking about Brahminical patriarchy and its violence upon its own women, before we even talk about, what is my experience as an upper caste Indian woman under Brahminical patriarchy, calling things out has just become fun for me. It's just become like a great fun thing to do. So calling things out is really important, especially when you have a platform and you have privilege. And it's relative privilege, right? Because in America, I'm told I'm a woman of color, and so I hold that identity and speak from that identity. But I think standing in solidarity with other people and also not being competitive with other women, that's something we have to unlearn, being competitive, and just celebrating when other people who are marginalized are doing well. That gives me a lot of joy and pleasure.
I love that. So fierce, bold.
Hi, no pressure. Let's see. What do I do to be whole? I'm very much connected in my community. I try very hard to turn off the performance, because of course we're all performing up here. We may not look like it, but this is all our performance voices, And so when I'm off stage, I turn it the hell off. And I'm still actually a lot like what you're hearing, but it's an internal shift, that is a thing that helps people who are on stage a lot be whole, so that we're not just spinning out in our roles forever. And also I believe very strongly in being a member of both the sciences and the arts and supporting other members of the sciences and the arts. So I do a lot to try to redirect the fire hose of money, which is always running out, at wonderful arts organizations and granting organizations for science and medical research. That's a thing that I'm just constantly doing, because I'm like, why does this lab have no money? Talk to this person. Why does this organization in the arts have no money? Talk to this person. Donate to Hedgebrook. She's into that. That's a thing. They're wonderful. You can look it up, because I don't want to seem like a shill, but do that though also. And I think, what else? Oh God, I'm not going to save the whole planet right now on this stage, but I'll say that the world can really, really, really suck, and we help each other get through it. I'll say that we in liberal spaces schism very quickly. We're very good at fighting the near enemy. We tear each other to pieces here and forget the rise of fascism, which is hella real, and they're real organized. So I would say probably one of the best ways out of that loop that we get in is just to approach with curiosity, right? Just remembering that actually we're all stumbling through this, and there is good work to be done. And it's probably more important to build coalitions, even with the people you might slightly disagree with, than it is to make sure to shoot them down. Yeah, that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I can't really see you all, but if there are questions in the audience, this is your moment. I see a hand. Do you want to come up and steal this microphone from me? Oh, there it is. Okay.
Hi. Can you hear me? Hi. Well, thank you very much. A lot of wonderful questions. So thank you. My question is about the artist, the writer, whose transgressions are such in the South Asian context that person gets erased out of society. I'm from Bangladesh, and I'm going to bring up the question of Taslima Nasreen, that many of you know, and those of you who don't know, she was a very transgressive feminist writer, but towards the end of her writing career in Bangladesh, around the early 1990s, she went against religious orthodoxy. And that created a storm where within India, Bangladesh, and the wider social context, because Salman Rushdie had the fatwa in '89, so I think this was in 1993 when she wrote Lajja, Shame, where she was also sent into exile. So what I'm trying to ask you is that we have talked a lot about gender politics. We have not talked about the politics of the state. They're not separate in certain contexts. So in the context of Taslima Nasreen writing Lajja, which was about, which focused on a Hindu family being persecuted and having to leave Bangladesh, it just played into the geopolitics. And her writing and her literary contribution, I don't want to go into Lajja because I think it's a, but I'm just giving for the audience here some background, that her literary contribution in terms of being a very transgressive feminist writer, she talked about female enjoyment and orgasm, from the female perspective. Men always write about it, right? But she wrote that, and that made men, as you were saying, the far end, Gokhale, Namita Gokhale, yes, that men loved that, but they also critiqued her very much. So what I'm trying to say is, what are your thoughts in the South Asian context of the relationship between gender and state politics and the erasure of the female voice?
Could I take the Taslima question? Because you said she was sent into exile. I'm not clear whether she went into exile or whether she was sent into exile. I'm not clear.
She was
but she lives in India. She's lived in European countries. She's lived around the world. She's a robust writer still. Her writing has, in fact, increased in its impact after these events. And she's published regularly by Penguin Random House in India and others. She's come to the Jaipur Literature Festival and spoken there, and she speaks around. So it's her strength remains, her courage remains, but Bangladesh I don't know enough about, because Bangladesh has huge literary traditions, and often very in my understanding, the Bangla literature has enormous capacity for diversity in its approach. But perhaps because she was so also fiercely anti-Islam, that led to her this thing. At least that's what her later recent pronouncements seem to say. And yeah, that was.
Yeah, I would add to that. I would add to that that you're raising something really important. It's the erasure of, when we say South Asia, we're usually talking about India, right? The representation is predominantly from India, and that is also predominantly Hindu. So it's definitely an erasure and a silencing. So I want to definitely, say thank you for calling that out. And also it's upper caste, if you go down names of people who get to represent and be on stage. So I think that is something to keep thinking about and address. And yeah, thank you.
Could we take the next two questions together and then the answers together, please? We're running out of time. Go for it.
Hi, I want to first applaud your clarity of thought and expression and the courage with which you brought these books out and kind of laid the path for the next generation of writers as well. What I want to know more about is the risks you faced, the disruptions to your lives that those produced, and also about your allies, both male and female, who helped you do what you did and get your voices out there.
Thank you. Let's do the next question and then go ahead.
My question's pretty short. I appreciate the opportunity to listen to all of you today, but my question is, given the context of a nuclear family, what do you think mothers are mostly confined to as their role? Maybe if that's kind of similar to her allies or people in her life or family, kids or husbands. That's my question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Could you repeat the last question?
Mothers in their role, how do you see mothers in their role?
Ooh. Nuclear family.
That's not an easy one, because within those of my family who have traveled to other countries, and they find the early years of looking after children not at all easy on the body, on the mind, on their economic lives and their working lives. And however much their partners may try to help, it seems to be, I live in a joint family, and I think the sense of community is really the only answer to that question as far as I'm concerned, wherever it may be, because everybody may not be able to have so much family as Sonora has brought. So I think Sonora is the person to answer that.
Happy to do that. I think I like the idea of disruption. So Darshana mentioned, what were the disruptions to your life and who were the people who came to help or stand in solidarity. And I think what we see as disruption, even to the nuclear family, is a necessary thing, because there are some disruptions that actually take you on a different path. I was all signed up for the patriarchal norm of being married, having the son, child, everything was going like perfectly as planned. And then the disruptions that I wasn't prepared for are the things that came to my rescue. I mean, I wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be at the happiest point of my life if it hadn't been for the disruptions. So what we see as disruptions, and sometimes, say like, oh, look what happened to her, like poor thing. That's not a poor thing, that's actually a great thing. So welcome the disruptions. There's discomfort in them. I'm not making light of the fact it was fucking difficult, but I think you land in a certain place that was not a garden that was promised to you, but is a garden nevertheless, and a prettier garden. And the people that come to your help, the incredible people show up. Because when you stop looking at the typical people who were supposed to help you, the genuine people and the authentic people and the people with integrity will show up.
Yeah. It's absolutely true. We are all up here well supported by so many. We stand up here with single voices, but they are actually the representation of whole communities that enabled those voices to rise, right? I have a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old. I hear they're alive. Okay? That's because my husband, Kayer, is watching them. My mother-in-law, who is a retired OB and a badass woman, immigrant woman, born in Nairobi, Gujarati, she supports me. She is amazing, and it is never a violation of my role as the parent of her grandchildren to do what I'm doing. It is modeling for them a life that is full of joy and success. Yeah? Because she wants better for her grandkids, right? She wants better for her grandkids than someone who is meant to shrink. Okay? So absolutely, I am here with their support. I will also tell you that I recently applied for a fellowship for this big thing at Harvard, and specifically to support women, and I realized that the majority of my recommenders were men, and that was weird for me. But it was true, because a lot of people in power in my life in the sciences and elsewhere where I've succeeded are definitely benefiting from their gonads, okay? They've just had a whole life, what that was supported by that, but they've been very supportive of me. But of the women who are in power who have also supported me, I've been pulled up by them. And so that's a big thing too. It's about pulling each other up, That's how we get here.
We could go on, but we can't. Thank you so much for being here, full house. Thank you for supporting this amazing literary festival. Thank you, my panel.